Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on engaging college students in the 2020 census. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. As a national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. Today, we're excited to dive deeper into how college students, organizations, and staff can get involved in ensuring that college students are counted in the 2020 census. Our guest speakers will discuss how the University of Chicago is planning to get out the count on their campus and local community, and how students can take part in APIAVote's Youth Ambassador Program. Sorry for the delay with getting started. We had some technical difficulties. And this webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the presentation and webinar will be shared with everyone after the event. As you may know, this webinar is the 13th installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide. And check out our census website at www.countusin2020.org for all of our webinars and accompanying summary blogs. The website also hosts our toolkit, fact sheets, partner resources, and more. If you haven't seen it, tune into our new census podcast, Counting Your Census, which was released earlier this month. And our first set of translated Get Out the Count fact sheets are being posted right now. This includes 6 fact sheets, which are available in 15 Asian languages. So if you check our website, there are a few up right now, and there will be the remaining languages posted later this week. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to our speakers. First, Raya Roy is the Program Associate for Census and Civic Engagement at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. She's responsible for working on policy research and analysis on census issues, developing communication strategies, and implementing advocacy campaigns. Next, we have Kirby Patel, who joined the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics in February 2019 as the Director of Civic and Campus Engagement. In this role, she advises the IOP's Civic Engagement student leadership, builds relationships with community partners, and works on civic engagement program development strategy. Previously, Kirby worked as an administrator in diversity and student life at Washington University in St. Louis, Loyola University, Maryland, and Oberlin College. Kirby is from Dallas, Texas, and graduated with a BA in history from Loyola University Chicago and an MA in college student personnel from Bowling Green State University. And finally, we have Julie Wu, who is a programs associate at APIAVote and works with the Youth Ambassador Program and as a graphic designer. Julie is a graduate of the Ohio State University with a BA in studio art in 2018. She's previously been involved with APIAVote as an ambassador and summer intern. During her time as an undergraduate student, she served as president of the Asian American Association on campus and has been actively involved with the Midwest Asian American Students Union as executive chairperson and vice conference director. The agenda that we have for today's webinar is up on the screen here. We will have Q&A at the end, and you can use the chat box or the questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. And once we get to Q&A, I will be repeating the instructions for submitting your questions. So thank you, and again, thanks for your patience and sorry for the delay.
Hi everyone, thanks Betsy for the introduction. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Raya Roy. I'm the Program Associate for Census and Civic Engagement at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and I primarily work on our census program. And before I kick it off to our awesome speakers today, I just wanted to give a quick overview on how college students are counted in the census. So college students living on campus are counted through a process called group quarters. This means that campuses will have housing administrators who will assist with developing a list of addresses and expected population count as of April 1st, 2020. And then Census Bureau employees will reach out to student housing administrators to schedule a visit and collect this information. So who exactly is counted? So students who live in college housing should be counted in their college address. Students who do not live on college housing should not be counted, should be counted in their off-campus housing locations. Students should only be counted in their parents' home only if they live and sleep there most of the year. So for students who are commuters and they don't live on dorms or off-campus housing but live at home, they can be counted in their parents' home if they sleep and live there most of the time. But if students live on either off-campus housing or in college dorms, then parents should not double count their students if they're living in their dorm and not with their parents. So foreign students are counted. College students who are foreign citizens living in the United States while attending college in the United States, living either on campus or off campus, are counted as the residents where they live and sleep most of the time. Students studying abroad are not counted, and then students who are U.S. citizens living outside the United States on Census Day are also not counted in the census. If anyone has any other questions or any other possible college living scenarios, please feel free to ask questions during our Q&A session. Now I will kick it off to Kirby.
Hi, everyone. My name is Porgy Patel. I serve as the Director of Civic and Campus Engagement at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. First, I just want to say thank you to Betsy and Raya and all of the folks at Asian Americans Advancing Justice who have deepened my own thinking and understanding, and of whom the work that they have contributed to, it's sharpened my own thinking and my own work. So I'm just really grateful to be able to contribute in a small way in their larger, very Herculean effort. I work at an Institute of Politics that's pretty new. It was started 6 years ago by David Axelrod, and the mission of my institute within the larger university structure is to inspire students to pursue lives of public service and become passionate and engaged in the process of politics as broadly defined as possible. And so if we can go to my next slide. I just have one slide, and I'll just be engaging folks really broadly and thinking in sharing some of my thinking. UChicago's approach in thinking about our own Get Out the Count effort is to inform, educate, and activate. So Rema's queue up was a really good lead into thinking about how I define informing is literally helping students understand where do they fit in the process, how do they fill out the form, where do they need to make sure they're counted, how do you engage the students in the process of just even knowing that a form might be coming and that there's this larger process and that it's not just about midterms, finals, et cetera, the kind of cadence of the academic year, that there's this other democratic and governmental obligation that they have. There's also an opportunity, and I think this for me feels more purpose aligned, to think about our larger purpose, which is to educate and activate students and help them build the democratic engagement skills that they'll use over the course of their lifetime. So when I'm thinking about education and approaching Get Out the Count efforts around the census, I'm also thinking about what's the utility of the census? How do we make sure students understand what the purpose of it is, that it happens every 10 years, that there might be hard to count communities and what those communities are? What are the kind of academic questions that you can ask that our students who are curious, bright, and engaged will definitely benefit from engaging with, and making sure that they're understanding the kind of larger purpose of the function of the census. And similarly, I feel lucky in most university campuses have efforts to get students involved within the community and in community engagement efforts really broadly defined. Our students at the University of Chicago are really activated and they want to be empowered to create change right now in their communities. And there is a need to get plugged in and get get support community-based and grassroots efforts. And so even thinking about how we offer opportunities for our students to understand what the community engagement opportunities are, how they fit in, and even thinking about the community engagement best practices of understanding who they are in terms of their deeper identities, how they can best contribute, how do they make sure that they're not creating harm or operating as saviors in census efforts, and actually intending to create good get out the count, full counts for folks. Some advice that I have are some institutional partners across campus that you should be engaging in the process of developing your get out the count plan are certainly student affairs and residence life. Residence life will have an obligation to enumerate the students that are already living on campus, and so they'll have some sort of folks designated within their department that'll be overseeing that process. But then in general, there are a number of students typically on most college and university campuses that live off campus, and there might be different ways to engage that particular population of students because their obligations are going to be slightly different. Similarly, engaging the folks in university and community engagement on campus, and then making sure that you're pulling at the threads with cultural and identity centers. Again, I feel really grateful to have benefited from Asian Americans Advancing Justice's work on the census, and we know that there are many different university campuses that might have multicultural units, diversity education units, and identity-based centers that are trusted places for the students that are on those campuses and that can serve as effective messengers and partners in this work. And it's important to think of them as players in the democratic engagement space on a university campus. Some resources that I want to just generally highlight there are plenty of folks that are doing work in this area that have toolkits or places where you can refer to and get additional information and guidance and support. We can go to the next slide. I use Nancy Thomas from the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education's approach to thinking that democracy should be 365 days. We shouldn't just be thinking about voting as the only cornerstone of democracy. And I think that the census is one of those natural ways that we can live that commitment out. And so making sure our census engagement is embedded within our broader democratic engagement, communication, and education is going to be essential. So the same players that are around the table thinking about student voter engagement are some of the same players that should be around the table when thinking about census engagement as well. Making sure you're leveraging and understanding the local landscape for census engagement with nonprofits, foundations, and government stakeholders. For the state of Illinois, it's been really important to make sure we're understanding what are the local complete count commissions. How are we making sure we're in conversation with those folks and that we're not recreating or duplicating efforts, that we're amplifying where we can, and that we're directing students to already organized efforts, particularly in that last point of wanting, if there are students that particularly want to be activated or empowered to do more. And then rely on the assets of your community. For us, we are an institute that programs a lot. We put on 100+ programs a year. We're really good conveners. And so we're thinking a lot about some of the ways that we reach students and community members are through programming. And in most cases, universities serve as this place that convenes both community and students in ways that are typically educational. And so thinking about that as an avenue for engagement. Another thing that we'll probably exercise is we have structural technology interventions. So one of the tools of our trade that we have benefited from in our voter engagement efforts that we're probably going to replicate and duplicate are for any student that registers for classes, they go through a campus confirmation process. And in that process, they're asked for things like, please help us understand and indicate what your preferred gender pronouns are, and some additional information that helps us just be a better resource for students across the board. And it's a campus information system. That same campus information system asks students if they want to be directed to a resource for voter engagement. And similarly, we'll likely build out some messaging or a landing page to help students understand that as they're registering for classes, that they should be also thinking about census and getting counted and those efforts across campus. It's one of those really passive ways that we actually reach a really broad set of stakeholders on campus and a lot of students. And students, it's a funnel and a pipeline that students have to cross. And so if there's a moment like that on campus, I would urge you to think about technology and technology interventions as a way that you might effectively leverage some resources to get out the count and help students understand. And then we're still thinking through this, but we know that we have really bright students and that they ultimately are the best and most effective ambassadors for their peers. And so we are thinking about doing social media and comms engagement that has students as the face for how to get counted, so that it doesn't feel like it's just a bunch of administrator emails, and that it ends up being a much more effective message. So those are some of the ways that we're thinking about our engagement on our campus. The last thing that I'll share is just some general resources. There are a couple of different resources that I'd be remiss if I didn't make sure they got in the hands of fellow colleagues. Young Invincibles has a census coalition that's connected in with a community partnerships person from the Census Bureau. It's a pretty active email coalition, and for any time that you have a small or large question, it's a really good group of colleagues who are thinking about these issues that you can passively send an email to and get a pretty quick response back from. Students Learn, Student Vote also has a coalition with the Census Coalition, and there are a couple of toolkits that I think are helpful resource guides as a place to start if you haven't gotten started thinking about this. The Higher Ed 2020 Census Toolkit, the American Libraries Association also has a toolkit for how to leverage libraries. And then in general, the Campus Compact Association, which is a service-based community engagement association across the country for universities, also has a Census 2020 hub that are important, I think, starting places that could help you get started. So with that, I will hand it over back to the AJ folks.
Thank you, Kirby, and we'll compile all of those resources and the toolkits that were mentioned, circulated to everyone who's on this webinar. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to Julie with APIAVote.
Hi everyone, this is Julie from APIAVote. I'm the program's associate here, and yeah, I can just do a really brief introduction of our organization. So we are Asian and Pacific Islander American Votes. We are a national nonprofit organization that works with partners throughout the nation as well as students to amplify the voices of APIs through civic participation. So next slide. So I'm just here to talk a little bit about our Youth Ambassador Program. And so this is actually the third cohort that APIAVote has ever worked with. I was actually part of the first cohort when I was in undergrad, so it's really cool to be on the other side. And every year we're learning and expanding the program as well. So this year we're actually working with over 30 campuses throughout the nation to implement voter registration and census education efforts on each of their campuses. So each ambassador organization we work with is an API organization on their campus, and so they are just gearing up and making sure that their peers are registered to vote and their peers are educated around the elections and around the census. And this program runs from September 2019 to November 2020, but we are thinking of opening it up for more students to join in just because 2020 is such a big year, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a little bit of what our program looks like and what the requirements are for our students. So next slide. I know I made a lot of slides for this one. So next slide. So the requirements. The first half of the program is actually this first school year, academic year. It runs from fall of 2019 to spring of 2020. And so within this school year, our students need to complete 3 voter registration events, 2 census education events. So those are workshops just to bring people out and make sure that they are educated about what the census means and how to participate in the census. And then 1 voter education event. And so they need to maintain 2 liaisons or 2 representatives from each organization that will be the points of contacts between APIAVote as well as their organization. Next slide. So funding, one of the incentives to get folks to join is $1,000 per campus for the entire duration of the program. As you may or may not know, a lot of student organizations, especially API student organizations, don't get a lot of funding from the university. So $1,000 goes a long way. And this 25% of this funding must go towards APIAVote initiatives. We just want to make sure that, they're spending this money on like food to get people out, because, what student doesn't come out for free food, right? Like, you reel them in with the free food, and then you hit them with that voter registration, hit them with that census education, and then yeah, so the funding will be allocated throughout the program. Next slide. Communication, we just have monthly calls with the students. So if you or anyone you know is interested in being part of the ambassador program, just know that there is constant communication with APIAVote, and we will walk you through all the processes, all the information needed to hold your own registration and education drives. And finally, documentation. We want to make sure that our students are documenting their events, taking photos, just to show the great work that they're doing. Next slide. So we recently, 2 weeks ago actually, just held our in-person youth ambassador training, where we flew out 2 liaisons from each organization to come to DC and join us just like in person. So it was really cool to see students throughout the nation just, convening together in DC, and just doing group bonding activities, doing census trainings, doing voter registration trainings, and just being engaged with one another. So in these photos, you can see the students are like building towers, and this is actually one of our interactive activities around the census. And then they're just doing like a door knocking activity where they're learning how to pitch a voter registration or census education initiative. Next slide. And one of the ways that we frame civic engagement, actually, I think it should show up at the bottom, but my slide was like an animation. So if you just like advance the slide, should pop up. One of the ways that we want to frame this conversation about the census, especially because it's once every 10 years, is it's part of civic engagement, right? It's constitutionally mandated. Everyone counts. And we want to make sure that students understand that it's not like a passive activity. It's something that comes around once every 10 years. It has such large impacts. We want to make sure that, like voter registration is something that you always think about when you think about civic engagement. You always see people on campus registering folks to vote. But even me, myself, like when I came to DC as an intern, that was the first time I've ever heard of the census. Like that information is not accessible within our own campus communities. So once again, it's even more important for us to educate the students and use them as and engage them as trusted messengers to get out the count to their families and their peers. Next slide. So this summer, during the summer, for folks who don't know, a lot of API interns actually come through DC to participate in the different programs that our community has to offer. And this past summer, we actually convened many of them in the new Facebook studio. We were actually the first ones to use it. And we created a Census PSA video. So I don't know if this is something that we can actually show right now. If not, I can link it as well later on. Is this something we can show right now? Okay, if I know there's some technical issues, so if that's not something that we can show right now, that's totally fine. Oh, there it is.
Hey, we're pulling up the video right now.
Oh, thank you.
I know the census is taken every 10 years to keep tabs on how many people are in the United States and see how the population is changing.
The census is critical in guiding the geographic distribution of federal funding.
The census impacts how much funds we get and how much power we have. The census impacts my community's funding for natural disaster and emergency relief. Funding for my high school, my own access to food, my families, and my community.
Accurate census data means that my community can be seen and that its needs can be addressed. Accurate census data affects my access to health insurance.
Accurate census data means my city can fix its housing crisis.
If we do not respond to the census, we may lose vital resources for important programs that keep many of us.
think the audio cut out.
Julia, this video looks beautifully made. I'm wondering, and I also can't hear the audio. I'm wondering where panelists might find this video.
Right, I could definitely link it. This is actually a first peek. We haven't released it publicly yet, but yeah, I will definitely link it so our the host can send it out to everyone who would like to see it. But thank you for playing it. At the end, they're just saying count us in 2020. And so if you could advance to the next slide. This is something that we want to release. Actually, we're releasing pretty soon. We want to make sure it gets out before Thanksgiving. And the ask that we're making of all of our ambassadors, as well as just youth programs, whoever sees it, whoever, like national, whatever national networks there are, or like student organizations there are, we would like students to make just really short clips and tell us why the census, it's important for them to get counted in the census. So as you can see in the video, people are saying like, oh, this is what the census affects for me. Like, this is why the census matters for me. The census data is used in this way. We just want to make sure that people are being engaged and just it's being amplified on social media, just because social media is so prevalent with the way that the youth interact with just one another. And so this is an ask that we're making. If you're on this webinar right now, or you're watching this webinar and this is something that you're interested in, definitely I'll have my contact info at the end. My email is jwu@apiavote.org. We are launching this soon. We're just working through some technical issues with the video shoots, but we are launching this soon with our ambassadors. And yeah, we're just using the hashtag count us in 2020, which is something that I know like Advancing Justice is using as well. And just a lot of different organizations are using count us in 2020 to amplify the census for the API community. And so this is just another way to get involved for students and just non-students alike as well. And next slide. And to apply for the ambassador program, I have the link down there, apia.vote/ambassador. Once again, the program has already kicked off, but we are thinking of, or we are opening up the application for more schools to join us, just because once again, 2020 is a very big year with just the census and the elections coming up. And so we're increasing our capacity and looking for other schools and organizations to join. So if you know anyone or you yourself are interested, definitely apply, and I will be available for questions as well. And yeah, that's all I have. Thank you so much for having us, Advancing Justice.
Thank you, Kirby and Julie, for those presentations and those great resources that you shared. Again, for everyone who's on the webinar, we'll be circulating the links to the different resources they both mentioned, as well as the recording and the presentation for this webinar. And with that, we'll get started with Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, you can either type it into the question spot or chat box, or you can raise your hand and have your line unmuted to ask the question. And the first question we have is for Raya. So if a person is studying abroad for spring 2020 from January to May 2020 only, should she be counted in the census?
Yeah, so from the guidance that we've gotten from the Census Bureau, if you're studying abroad and you're not attending college in the United States, then you will not be counted in the 2020 census.
Thanks, Raya. And we have a question for Julie. Can you address how you're working to engage community college students who might actually be more diverse than non-community college students in terms of age or culture through your Youth Ambassadors program?
Yeah, definitely. So community colleges, we actually don't have any in our program right now. We do the outreach, but this is a program where like organizations and schools who are interested in attending opt in. They like submit the application, and we didn't get any from community colleges this year. We did some outreach, but one thing that I know, one struggle that I know is that there's a higher turnover, and even with just like schools in general, like there's always turnover. Seniors are going to graduate in the summer, and this program runs throughout November 2020. So there is the summer between, and we do like kind of struggle with turnover. And so I don't have a clear answer to that just because right now we don't have any community colleges opting into our program, but we are doing the outreach. And once again, we have opened up the applications once again, and we are trying to get more diverse like slew of schools in our program as well. But that's definitely something, like community colleges are definitely colleges that we would like to work with.
Thank you. And another question, can you share one or more highlights of how nonprofits can support census counts for students on campuses from information that you've come across? And so I can answer this question. This is Betsy from Advancing Justice AJC, and then Julie, if you want to also address what APIAVote is doing. I think for one thing we've learned is just the need for in-language materials. So at Advancing Justice, we are working on translating a series of Get Out the Count fact sheets, which include information on the census, ranging from how are people counted, the internet response option, language assistance and different resources. And we're getting those fact sheets translated into 15 Asian languages. And we're also working with a partner, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, and they are tailoring these fact sheets specific to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities and getting those translated as well. So I think one way that we want to help students is recognizing that there might be certain language barriers, or maybe people would like the information in a non-English language. So that's a resource that we're producing as part of Advancing Justice in the Canvas in 2020 campaign. And Julie, do you want to address what APIAVote is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Advancing Justice has some really great resources. So one thing we do is like amplify them to the students because they don't know where to look. I know during our in-person training, there were so many questions. It was kind of like everybody was coming in with a blank slate. And one of the most frequent questions I get is, like where do I even start with educating the peers on my campus around the census? And so APIAVote, for our program, we are creating materials, slideshows, speaking points, so we can train our ambassadors with those materials, and they can just take those materials and implement them on their campuses as well. And one thing about youth engagement is that, and this might go for everyone just in general, folks don't really like to just sit through a lecture most of the time, especially like through student organizations, there's always the issue of engagement. And so we are trying to come up with more like game-based activities or more interactive activities. I know we have, we worked with Advancing Justice to create a census scenarios quiz where there's just different census, like very nuanced census scenarios. And then we try to turn that into a game, like who can come up with the animal noise, and it's like Jeopardy style, whichever animal noise we hear first gets to answer the question. So it becomes a competition. Or like we have a census building activity where everybody kind of like is allocated different materials based on just something like, I'm just taking a look at groups and seeing like who has the most glasses, who's wearing the most glasses, and I'll secretly like give them more materials than the other group. And then when we debrief, we talk about like, hey, like even though you had the same amount of people in both of your groups, it matters who gets counted, right? And so like in the census, in this activity, you don't get to choose, but in the actual census, you get to choose whether or not you count, and you want to make sure that you get counted so the resources get allocated to our communities. So just making interactive options for our students is something that APIAVote is really working on creating.
Thanks, Julie. And Kirby, can you share a little bit more about how you're preparing your students and staff at the University of Chicago to get at the count in terms of any training or resources that you're sharing with those networks?
Yeah, I'm definitely amplifying what you all have already created. So that's helpful. And then just because I've been doing a fair amount of research, Young Invincibles is going to come out with specific to higher ed, like changeable, where you can like use your own university branding or colors resources. that are meant for you to be able to like simplify these messages around who should be participating, how should they be participating, in some instructions that you all should know that are in progress and in development. I mean, the other thing that I guess I would just connect the dot on is for students and nonprofit organizations, it actually is, I think, really, and this is my bias being a campus administrator, but I do think it's important to include campus administrators in the conversation, mainly because there might be some like easy ways that people can remove some barriers and engagement or get the message to a broader set of stakeholders than maybe one campus group can. And so working with folks who students might naturally not necessarily go to because they might not have a relationship with like a like service office or a community engagement office, but who would be totally willing partners and are already likely, if they're not already thinking about this, are really open to thinking about how to support students.
Thank you. It's a great tip. And a question for Rima, who submits the census form in dorms?
Sure. The way that college students are counted on in dorms and on campus housing is through group quarters, and that could be done in one of three ways. So it could be done through in-office enumeration, where the Census Bureau comes to the college and there's a transfer of electronic data from the university to the Census Bureau, or the Census Bureau staff could come to pick up a paper listing from the school administrator, or there's a drop-off pickup format where the Census Bureau staff will come and actually bring paper questionnaires for students to fill out. So there's the electronic transfer of data, there could be a paper transfer of data, or they will themselves come to the university to hand out forms to students to fill out and collect those. So it could be done in one of those three ways.
Thanks, Rima. And I think a question for all of us is if we're targeting specific institutions, like minority serving institutions, which includes APIAVote, Hispanic serving institutions, and other institutions in our higher ed outreach. And I don't know, Kirby, if you're able to speak to the work that you're seeing from Young Invincibles, and then Julie for your Youth Ambassadors program.
You know, I want to be really honest when it comes to, and maybe this is just like the very honest truth around like what I've observed, having been a higher ed administrator now at multiple institutions. I think people are engaging with census stuff like just now starting to think about it, and that's the people that are really, really proactive. And so as the advice that I have for either nonprofit folks or other folks that might be outside of a university setting is that because this process happens every 10 years, even the university infrastructure internally doesn't have a really strong muscle memory around how to do just even the basic like group quarters enumeration that they're obligated to do. It's just not top of mind. And so I am not necessarily seeing some of that targeted outreach, and I think that's where to me like a cultural center and or the folks who convene like HBCUs, minority serving institutions, et cetera, are just starting to get there. And I am not as aware, but I am just one voice. And I've worked at mostly predominantly white institutions. So that is just my background and context.
Yeah, I mean, I think tacking on with the Youth Ambassador program, we are really targeting Asian American Pacific Islander students through the groups that we work with. So just understanding the constituency of like the different ambassador organizations. There's a lot of like Pan-Asian organizations, specific ethnicity-based organizations, but the programming all is geared towards the larger API community on their campuses. So we like to emphasize that. Sometimes they ask, like our students ask, like, hey, like if we register folks who are non-Asian, does that so count? Or if we like talk to students or like try to appeal to students who are non-Asian, does that still count? Yeah, of course it counts. Like we're trying to make sure this information is available to everyone, but the work that we do, we're specifically targeting APIs on campus. So that's just something that we really want to be intentional about when shaping the program.
Thanks, Julie. And this is Betsy from Advancing Justice AAJC. Our targeting is also the broader Asian American, Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community and individual community leaders as well as community-based organizations that serve these communities. From our messaging research, we found that the most trusted messengers around the census and get out the count are friends and family. So that's really the audience that we're trying to target with our outreach. And one last question, and this is for you, Julie. This is around your census scenario quiz. Is that something we could circulate to everyone after the webinar?
I want to say yes, but I'm going to touch base with our executive director first, but I do think we can probably circulate that.
All right, thank you so much. It looks like we have no further questions at this time. As a reminder, we'll be circulating the recording and the presentation, as well as a compilation of the different resources that Kirby and Julie had mentioned on the webinar. And if there's any follow-up questions that people have afterwards, we'll share everyone's contact information. But thank you so much for joining us today. And again, we're sorry for the technical difficulties and appreciate your patience with the late start on this webinar. Thank you.